Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Theater. It's the podcast coming to you from Music City, USA that takes a look at relationships and mental health through the lens of movies, TV, and pop culture. My name is Josh Treese, and I am so excited that you're back. This past week on the show's Twitter, at Therapist Theater, THERAPISTTHTR, I mentioned that each week's guest and I are going to start answering any question you may have about relationships and mental health at the end of each show. Do you have a question that you'd like answered? Send it to the show's email, therapisttheater@gmail.com, and we'll answer it anonymously. In our last episode, I said in the intro that you can find and recommend to others to listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. This week, I added another place you can find the show. If you like listening to things being played in video format, you're in luck. Therapist Theater is now on YouTube. So just go search the show's name and you can listen in your web browser. This week's guest is Jared Farley. He's not just a therapist in Music City, he's also one of my very best friends and was a groomsman in my wedding. He brought an interesting movie to the theater, and I'm sure you guys are going to love his perspective on it. So with that, let's dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. How long I'd been dreaming of the podcast and how long and how the person that I had as a guest was at the top of the list and they were one of my favorite people, and I was like, but they were and they are, and this and
so I'm fourth on your dream list.
No, not fourth. No, there's no rankings because the list goes horizontally, so everybody's on the same line. Nice. As far as
it's a great reframe.
Joy and desire of having guests on goes, but that's true. Obviously. I think because of the nature of our friendship, you being one of my groomsmen, one of my best friends, like anything that I do creatively, career-wise, whatever, you're going to be on the list of wanting to have, me wanting to have involvement of it.
Yeah.
And so, of course, like, whenever I started having the idea for this and started scribbling, I guess metaphorically, notes into my Evernote app, about ideas for episodes and guests and yada yada yada, like top of the list. It's a crowded top, I guess. And part of that's just because of how much I love you and because of what our friendship is. But the other part is because of the work that you do in mental health and in therapy, and the knowledge base that you have for it. So, I mean, kind of starting out, what was it about therapy? Like, why did you head into a career in therapy?
Yeah, so growing up in Florida, where I'm from, was super involved in church I usually joke that I was born in the church because I was there so often, Sundays and small groups, and all my friends were there. And so growing up and all that and having all this knowledge of and really having this life and this persona of what I'm supposed to be like, and then struggling with mental health issues, struggling with my own addiction in the background, and kind of having this split life of I have kind of this on the forefront. I have this desire to live this life that the church is telling me about and the Bible talks about, and yet I feel more in bondage than anything. And I think that's the story of a lot of people, especially in the church. And so it wasn't until probably my freshman year of college when my stuff really just kind of hit the fan and blew up, and I got engaged and invited to start therapy, to start my own journey with that. And so I was 18 years old, and started meeting with a guy who became a lot more than just like a therapeutic type relationship. Really became a mentor, and But started at 18 and started going through my own story and owning it and looking at it and understanding it instead of trying to numb it and medicate it. So I was working on all of that, my own emotions really, which had been stifled for so long. And then come 2013, so I'd been done with my undergrad, had an opportunity to kind of make some life changes. So moved out of the house I'd lived in for my entire life, had never even moved. And I decided, yeah, I'm going to quit my full-time job. I'm going to move out of the only house I've lived in, and I'm going to end a pretty significant romantic relationship, and I'm going to move to a place where I have none of that. And we're just going to go for it. And so that was my move to Nashville, and started my graduate studies at Trevecca here in Nashville in 2014. I'm looking and you're nodding, so I'm assuming you know
I'm
that.
just nodding.
I know.
Like I'm following. Yeah.
So I started around then. I started this marriage and family therapy program because it was really the piece of having a compassionate person sit across from me, and know that I would leave that relationship, that I would leave the context of that therapeutic relationship. I would leave before they would, which was always a fear of mine. Like, if you really knew me, you'd leave. And so having a relationship like that, which helped me understand and process my own story so that I could understand the gospel even better, to where I do have the life that Scripture talks about. I do have the freedom. I do have the joy. Joy mixed with sorrow, so it's not like everything just became happy and go lucky, because anybody that has a pulse knows that life is tragic. But being able to have joy in the midst of that, being able to experience my emotions and feel my feelings, give them to God, give them to other people, and help other people do the same. Most of the work I do with clients is in the emotional realm, because most of us aren't shamed or told not to biologically function. We're usually not shamed for thinking, but we often are shamed for feeling, which is the other third of our brain that the other two don't deal with. So I started seeing clients in my internship at a local place called the Refuge Center for Counseling, which was just an incredible experience and just a blessing to be there, and got to work with individuals really of all ages, as young as 8 and as old as kind of mid-40s. Worked with couples, premarital, couples in crisis, worked with some groups, some men's groups, which is really kind of what we'll be doing today, talking about movies and emotions, and loved that, and got done with my studies in May, and have been working. I'm about to come on with a local counseling agency called Sage Hill, and then I also work for a ministry that's called Men of Valor, which works with men that are transitioning out of prison. And myself and my mentor, we meet with them a couple days of the week, and we are able to do group work with them, group therapy and psychoeducation, and do some individual counseling with them, and just help them not just transition back with like the typical checklist of things that men need to come out of prison, but also help them reintegrate emotionally and socially back into society as well. So
Wow.
yeah.
So there's a couple of things I heard in there. One is, it seems like, and you correct me, this is what I'm hearing, it seems like that part of the journey that got you to therapy as a career was the healing and change that took place with you in therapy as a client.
Yeah. I don't really know a whole lot of people that are wired to, excuse me, to just sit across from people for hours and hours and just hear, these people's stories that are often, especially at the beginning, more just tragic and heartbreak and trauma and all of this stuff. I don't know a whole lot of people that want to or have a passion to do that haven't had somebody sit across from them and hear their story and hear their trauma, hear their tragedy, hear all of that. So that's my story for sure, is having that man that sat across from the room and said, I see you, I hear you, I'm not going anywhere. I don't judge you, I don't reject you. Needing that to understand so that I can look at my own story and say, okay, Jared, me, I don't judge you. I don't reject you. I don't hate you. You're worth, you have worth. You're not worth less than anybody else. You're not worthless. So having that experience for me was really the only way that I really had the courage and the anger and the passion to say, all right, I'm going to try and be this for somebody else, even if it's just one person.
Yeah. Which I would say, I mean, that's part of my story as well. You know, what I received as a client in therapy changed me so much that I wanted to give it to other people. Something else that you said that I wanted kind of to highlight on was you talked about your therapist helping you to understand your own story. And it's something that in the last episode we touched on a little bit with Aaron Carr. Like, I'm going to use terms that I don't really like: pre-therapy, in therapy, post-therapy, but maybe pre-therapy, potentially feeling like, if we're in the context of a story, a character in a story being written by somebody else that maybe you don't necessarily have control or agency in the story, or certainly you're not aware of any control or agency, or maybe you're not taking advantage of it, then kind of moving in the therapy room to a place of maybe somebody who is reading the story and learning the story and taking the information of it in, to finally being an active author of your own story. And just kind of being, you know, you mentioned awareness of feelings, aware of, you know, where your heart is at, what your heart is telling you, to the point where you're able to actively choose, you know, what do I want to do with this life of mine?
Well, and in one of the previous podcasts, there's a mention of this mother who's talking to this character and saying, why are you like struggling with suicide? Why are you sad? Why are you da 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 da? You don't, like, there's food on the table, there's a roof over your head, there's not a really reason to do that. And I think, especially in what we'll talk about today with this idea of addiction and how it plays out in the entire system. It's not just an individual. It's parents, it's siblings, it's friends, it's coworkers. It impacts everybody that's around it. Everybody has a role to play in the addiction. There's this element that was in my story, and I think is in a lot of addict stories of, like, how did I get here? Like, I shouldn't have ended up here based on my story and my background. Like, there's no reason. I hear other people share stories of being abused and beaten and all this stuff. And so it kind of makes sense that they would go to addiction or something. But like for me, like I had parents that were around, they, you know, never separated. So like, how did I end up here? And that was something that was, and is still sometimes a journey for me to go on, is looking at somebody that's struggling with addiction. If you look at their life in context, like their entire life, and not through some type of filter that maybe they're trying to make sense of their life through, but if you just look at the facts of their life, addiction makes perfect sense. And a lot of people look at addicts and say that's crazy, stuff they're doing is crazy, the way they ended up there is crazy, and it's only when we take the time to sit down and zoom out of just the addictive behavior and look at a person's story in context. We hear the sadness and the loneliness and the longing and all the reasons that the heart needed to be medicated. We can zoom out and say, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I would probably go to drugs too. I'd go to sex too. I'd go to alcohol too, because that's painful.
Well, I even think, you know, kind of zeroing in on the word you use there, you know, thinking that when you look at an addict, that's crazy. In my experience, crazy has really been a dismissive word. You know, it's used when the speaker maybe doesn't understand. Maybe they don't want to take the time to understand. And so, you know, I'm going to dismiss this person or this idea as crazy, as insane, as illogical, as it doesn't make sense. But I think like you were saying, you know, systemically, which is kind of becoming a buzzword, you know, on this show, systemically, if you were to be able to kind of zoom out, take that 35,000 feet view, within the context of the system and the story that the person's in, it makes sense. Now, saying something makes sense isn't necessarily saying it was the right quote unquote choice, that it was the healthy choice,
it's
that
not
it was the
permissive.
productive choice. Yeah. But it's easier to understand if you have all of that information. And so, like, we've mentioned a few times now addiction. Addiction is something that you in your work deal with. It's something that in my work I deal with. But I also think that it's something, and this kind of harkens back to the whole purpose of this podcast. It's something that is depicted a lot in movies, television, pop culture.
It's very dramatic. It's easy to show on a screen.
But I don't necessarily know if people have a real understanding of what it is. If you were going to describe addiction, and maybe not addiction to any particular thing, but addiction in general to somebody that didn't have a concept of what it is, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so I think the best way to frame it, which is probably going to clash with a lot of people, even clinicians that may be listening to this, but it's hopefully something that can be helpful and can be something to explore. And you can blow up my email if you have questions or don't like it. That's fine. I'll list my email at the end. But for me, addiction is not the problem. Addiction is an attempted solution to the real problem. And so the crafty thing with addiction is that it works at first, and so it does feel like a solution. But it's chronic, it's progressive, and all addiction, regardless of what it's to, whether it's attention, affirmation, whether it's approval, you just want the number of likes on Facebook or Instagram or whatever the kids are using these days, whether it's something that is more traditionally seen as an addictive substance like alcohol or drugs, or we see a lot clinically, even though it's not in something like the DSM, sexual compulsivity and risky behavior with that. All of those are means to cope and to make sense. In the work I do, people tend to not be numbing and medicating, and I tend to talk about these three arenas because it's the way I look at how the brain is kind of broken down with my training and the books I've read and all that stuff. There's the three kind of elements. There's the reptilian brain, which runs like, I don't know, your heart and breathing and the autonomic and everything that just makes the body move, right? That's the brain that runs the vessel, right? And then you've got the limbic brain, which is the emotional, and then you've got like the logic and the reasoning and the rational brain. And so most people aren't numbing because of thoughts they're having. They're numbing because they were never given space or language or freedom to feel. And so that's why I always go to that with clients, because I find that when people are able to understand and process and articulate and share feelings in a safe context, whether it's me, whether it's a significant other, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whatever it is, when they're able to share and be seen and be known, and really answer the two questions of do I matter and do I belong, then the need to cope is reduced and goes away over time. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not still significant work that can be done within specifically the addiction cycle, as far as like long-term and preventative maintenance and things like that. But ultimately, the drug is not the problem. The drug is the solution to the problem that has itself become a problem.
Right. It's certainly the attempted solution.
Yeah. And that's where like it works. Like drugs work, alcohol works, sex work. Like, you get the dopamine high, and the chemical rush of all of those things, and it works. But the heart will win. And there's only one of two things you can do with the heart. You can numb it or you can stop it, which I think is really prevalent that you started the podcast on suicide, because I think ultimately when the numbing stops and the heart gets so loud, and it hasn't been dealt with, the only way to make the heart stop is to make the heart stop.
Yeah. So you mentioned addiction being the attempted solution to a problem. One of the things that I try to lean in as much as I can with whenever I'm talking with people about addiction is, And I think this is a pretty apt definition of what the problem is that addiction is an intimacy disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Addiction is the inability to form healthy emotional bonds with others. And the way that it fleshes itself out in a person's life is, you, I, the rest of humanity, and we've said this in a previous episode with that a basic need of humanity is a need to belong. I think that's a very macro description of it, because I think a micro version of it is I've got needs that can only be filled relationally.
Mm-hmm.
I have loneliness needs. I have needs that, even though I'm a very independent, very capable, person, no matter how smart I am or how hard I work, I can't meet those needs on my own.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have other people. If I have an inability to form healthy emotional bonds with other people, that means that I have needs that are going unmet.
Mm-hmm.
And if I have needs that are going unmet, then inside of my soul at like a really deep level, I've got these longings and these desires that keep calling out and calling out and calling out. And eventually, I'm going to have to feed those needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so addiction is a person's effort to meet those relational, intimate heart needs on their own.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I'm gonna make myself feel powerful. I'm gonna make myself feel loved, feel
Mm-hmm.
needed, feel wanted. And I'm gonna do it in a way that I can control and that I can access, quote unquote, anytime that I want. And that I'm going to be able to control the amount of frequency of, what have you. Addiction is the self answer
Mm-hmm.
to that.
And I think there were elements of what you were saying that this word kind of came to mind. Everything you were describing characterizes this word. It's a way to get your needs met safely, meaning because when we're trying to be intimate with other people, it's a very inviting opportunity for both the real connection that we long for and also the real possibility that they may not meet those needs.
Intimacy
and
versus
they may reject us.
hurt.
Yeah. Like risk and hurt are that's the buy-in, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the ante. You have to pay that. You have to be willing to pay that in order to engage in relationship. What addiction does is it says, and even if you look at like neurologically what happens in the brain when it's on drugs, the same parts of the brain that light up when we're engaging in an intimate relationship, and I don't mean intimate as like intercourse or sex, but like just when I'm seen and known and connected on a basic attachment level, which you and I both love attachment theory. We both do a lot of work around that. The same parts of the brain that light up when we're connected to another individual are the parts of the brain that light up when people use heroin and cocaine and alcohol. Like it is tricking the brain, and it's doing it in a way that there's no risk.
Mm-hmm. I like to say it's doing it in a way that there's no cost, which I think we're saying the same thing. Like relationally, to be in relationship with someone, to have true intimacy, it costs.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pay. And I don't mean with money, but like you have to give of your true self to another person.
And the reason that for me that's costly is because, man, you are really risking like the safety of this bubble of I can't feel hurt if nobody really knows me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's
an armor.
This cocoon shell effect, which you also can't be known in that. So we're numbing the hurt, but we're also numbing the intimacy and the gladness.
That
and the
armor is going to
forgiveness
keep out weapons, but it's also going to keep out hugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We both just grinned. You guys can't see that on the podcast, but the cheesiness of that last line just now.
Yeah. And I think that I love that you picked this movie, because I think that Warrior really shows that in a very visceral, really real way. So Warrior came out in 2011. Tom Hardy, Nick Nolte, Joel Edgerton. And to give like a brief description of it, thank you, IMDb. Two brothers face the fight of a lifetime and the wreckage of their broken family within the brutal, high-stakes world of mixed martial arts fighting in Warrior. A former Marine haunted by a tragic past, Tommy Riordan, which is Tom Hardy's character, returns to his hometown of Pittsburgh and enlists his father, a recovered alcoholic, and his former coach to train him for an MMA tournament, awarding the biggest purse in the history of the sport. As Tommy blazes a violent path toward the title prize, his brother Brendan, Joel Edgerton, a former MMA fighter unable to make ends meet as a public school teacher, returns to the amateur ring to provide for his family. Even though years have passed, recriminations and past betrayals keep Brendan bitterly estranged from both Tommy and his father, which is Nick Nolte, whose character's name is Patty. But when Brendan's unlikely rise as an underdog sets him on a collision course with Tommy, the two brothers must finally confront the forces that tore them apart, all the while waging the most intense winner-takes-all battle of their lives. So, I mean, the description makes it sound like this is a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie from the 80s, which, you know, there is certainly a lot of action in it. It is an MMA movie after all.
Yeah. And a good MMA movie, not these crazy, you know, depictions of it. Like, it's got, as an MMA fan, like, I actually appreciate watching it just for the MMA stuff.
Okay. Okay. And it certainly has that, but it also has a really, really powerful example of what addiction can look like within the context of a system and what it can do when it reaches out and spider webs into the relationships that the addict has with those that they love. So if we take a look at the beginning of the movie, like the very opening scene has the dad, Patty, leaving what, I mean, they didn't explicitly say it, but I assume is a 12-step meeting.
It's an AA meeting.
Yeah. He's leaving that, and he, you know, is saying goodbye to people there, gets into his car, and he turns on an audio recording, maybe a book on tape, I don't know, but an audio recording of Moby Dick.
Moby Dick, yeah.
And it begins to, and I mean, I think, you know, for me, it's been, when I say it's been a long time since I've read Moby Dick, I mean, it's been my entire life because I've never read it. So it took me a while to recognize what it was. But then once I clicked it into it, he's listening to that on his way home. And then when he arrives at his home, we see Tommy, played by Tom Hardy, sitting on his steps waiting on him. And then through the context of the story and through what Tommy says, you know, we learned, you know, he's been away for 14 years. He's back. He's sitting on his dad's porch drinking. And when his dad comes up, he invites him in. And then we learn from things that Tommy is saying that the dad used to be an alcoholic, but is sober now. And Patty, the dad's name, says many times throughout the beginning of the movie, almost 1,000 days sober. And I think we did the math right before the episode, and that's 2 years and 9 months, right around.
Yeah, right.
So he's like really close to nailing 3 years of sobriety. But when Tommy comes in, having not seen his dad in 14 years, you know, Tommy is still trying to speak the old language that this relationship had. He tries to offer his dad a drink, you know, and his dad turns it down. Tommy says, "Oh, did you change brands?" And he says, "Well, that's not for me anymore." So he goes and gets some coffee, and the dad does, and tries to offer it to Tommy, and Tommy turns the coffee down. And then he begins to kind of fire off facts about himself, his mom, who we learn, like, the mom and dad divorced, you know, Tommy left with the mom, that he assumed his dad didn't know, like that his mom died. He says, you know, and Patty says, you know, I hired a guy to find you guys after I got sober. And he says, well, did your guy tell you that I had to rub her down with holy water because she didn't have health insurance? And so his dad, you know, several times in that beginning scene apologizes to him. And Tommy said something that just, I think, rings in my head. He says, you know, "Oh, you know, did you find Jesus?" And then he says something along the lines of, you know, Jesus wasn't there to save mom, even though she was calling out his name. He was down
at the mill saving all the drunks.
Down at the mill saving all the drunks, yeah. And I think what we're really seeing in that scene right there is the hurt that is still so present in between Tommy and the dad. In fact, Tommy, is saying all of these things, and then eventually, because he was drinking before he showed up, he was drinking on the doorstep when he showed up, he continued to drink during the conversation. And there's one part where the dad is saying something to him, and Tommy takes a drink, and when he lowers the bottle, and I think this just speaks to how good Tom Hardy is. When he lowers the bottle, if you look in his eyes in that scene, there is so much rage and hurt and like in his eyes looking at his dad, that he ends up passing out like in the middle of the conversation while he's drinking. But it's a great example of just seeing there is still so much not dealt with hurt between these guys.
And in addition to just even the alcohol, like you see and you see throughout the beginning portion of the movie as well, like there's this cross addiction with prescription medication as well. So even as he's on the doorstep, he's washing down these prescription pills that he's got with that alcohol, which we know can be really dangerous as well. And so, but yeah, this dialogue ensues, and you hear a lot of the chaos that historically was part of the relationship for Patty, for Nick Nolte's character, the father, because he's sober and there's a lot that happens with Tommy and his mom. He even said, it wasn't enough for us just to drive west and hit the coast. We had to drive north to get away from you too.
Yeah, which this is taking place, the story in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. So the relationship had become so toxic between the entire family that it literally splits the family. And he even says it wasn't enough for us to just drive west and hit the coast. We had to drive north too. And then he talks about how his mom got sick. I don't remember if there's a mention of cancer or something like that, but that's kind of what's implied. No health insurance. So the mom goes this religious route with holy water, and there's the whole time. And again, this is where, like you said, Tom Hardy is just a phenomenal actor. You can tell he's just oozing this resentment. Right. It's literally pouring out of him. And you and I say all the time with clients, hurt people. Right. And so it's so clear that all of this hurt that he's throwing these daggers, and you can see Nick Nolte character, now that he's sober, is feeling it. He's taking these daggers and he's like, oh, this sucks. And it's a consequence of what my relationship to him was like, what my relationship to his mom, to my wife was like. Clearly an abusive relationship. It's mentioned that there's a passing statement asking if his dad was seeing anybody, and
he says there's not really a woman's touch in the house anymore.
And then
he
Tom
says,
Hardy
I'm done
says
with women.
It must be hard to try to find a woman that she can hit nowadays.
Can take a punch.
Take a punch. Yeah. So clearly like toxic relationship. But the thing that we were kind of talking about with addiction as the means to numb the heart, I think that one scene is so obvious and clear. The heart starts to come up. There's all this hurt. There's this bitterness. There's this resentment. So it's coming out sideways, right? It's with addicts, as I counsel them, I let them know that typically the number one emotional cause of relapse is resentment, which in the lens that I do therapy with is coming. It's really hurt. It's just coming out sideways. It's an unwillingness to feel my hurt, so I'm going to try to hurt you. It's often described as drinking poison, hoping the other person dies.
Yeah, I think it's, when we feel hurt by another person and we refuse to acknowledge it, we refuse to deal with it, what ends up happening, and in effect what a resentment is it's a refusal to acknowledge that in the context of this relational hurt, I had a part. That's not saying that I had blame, but that's saying I had a part in this. And so what resentment is it's a complete and total focus on the other party in the relationship. And because of the hurt, it's just ruminating and thinking and blaming the other person. And what I find a lot is, and this isn't a general truth, but in the context of resentment, oftentimes it's pretty heavily weighted in one side of the relationship. One person in a relationship, two people usually don't resent each other. Usually and there can be hurt on the other side, there can be anger, but resentment kind of resides on one side. And so because of that, like what you said, drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. In that scene, we see, Tommy come home, and this is a picture of his relationship with his dad. A little bit later, we see the dad drive to, there's the dog.
There it is.
We see a relationship that must be, he can hear whenever FedEx or UPS comes.
Awesome.
He drives up to some other place in Pennsylvania. I don't remember where Brendan lives, but he drives to see his other son. And so far in the story, we were introduced to Brendan by seeing video footage of him at a kid's birthday party. Like, he's sitting on the porch. His wife is, going around filming stuff. And his two little girls he's got a frilly hat on, and they're painting his face. And painting, the mom's like, oh, what's going on here? And the dad's like, well, looks like daddy's a pretty princess right now. And, so the dad drives up, and he is sitting in a car at night on the street. Brendan pulls into his driveway and gets out. And then the dad gets out of his car. And I believe he might have been listening to Moby Dick in the car at that time too. But he gets out of his car, and he immediately, and I feel like this is a really old school way of showing, I don't quite know, submission or maybe willingness or vulnerability, but he immediately takes his hat off and holds it in his hands and kind of wrings it a little bit in front of his...
There's definitely a level of anxiety that's happening there. There's this fear and anticipation of... Because, and we see and hear this later on in the scene, he knows to some degree that he's not welcome there. Because... He says this phrase of opening up. He wants to open up some lines of communication. So there's definitely some relational distance that's happened between him and his son and his granddaughters, that one of which he hasn't even seen up to this point. But he says this line of I'm wanting to open up some lines of communication, and his son Brennan says, well, you've got two lines. You've got the phone and the post office. Yeah. And so he knows, even as he pulls up, as he's sitting there, he knows that there's these, what you and I would call boundaries that are in place. And he knows that he's butting up against them. He's testing them. He's going to try to see, because of a very common pattern within an addiction realm is poor boundaries, right? So there's people that are enabling. There's people that say they're going to do something, but then don't hold up to that. And that's a very common relational pattern I see within the couple's context. If I'm seeing like a married couple, or if I'm seeing between the two subsystems of a parent and a child, there can be a lot of poor boundaries that tend to happen that helps exacerbate and continue the cycle rather than help and heal it.
Yeah, and in that scene when he gets out and begins to talk to Brendan, he tells him, Tommy's home, he came to the house, and Brendan is kind of taken by surprise by that, and he says something along the lines of, did he ask about me? Does he want to see me? Something like that. So you see the brother, they haven't been in contact for a while. Clearly Brendan, would love to talk with him. A little bit later, he tells his dad, you tell Tommy if he wants to see me that this is where I am. Another, I guess, example of a boundary. Although I guess it could be a willfulness kind of thing. He's not really willing to budge. But whenever the dad, and he says he drove up to tell him this, and Brendan asks him something along the lines of, is there something wrong with your hands? Yep. Because phone calls and post office, you could have done that. And then, so Brendan says something like, Dad, I got to go inside. My family's in there. So he opens up the door to go inside. His wife and two daughters come, and the dad is like, oh my gosh, and I forgot the daughter's names, but like, is that so-and-so? She's grown so much. And then is that the other daughter? I've never even met her. And that kind of thing. So I think this is a really, really good example of the consequences of what addiction can give. And not only that, but you would think a person who's been in recovery, who's been sober for nearly 3 years, that they have, quote unquote, graduated.
They've earned it
from addiction.
Yeah.
And so everything is going to be,
Yep.
you know, sunshines and rainbows. And that, you know, you're going to have just everything that addiction took from you, that everything that addiction ran rampant and wrecked and had effects on. But I think what this scene shows is sometimes there's lasting consequences for addiction.
Yep.
And while I think, you know, which leads to something Brendan said. Brendan said in that scene, you know, the dad said, I just need you to forgive me. And he said, I do forgive you, but I don't trust you. Yeah.
And then dad, and this is very common. I hear this a lot with clients, or if my client's the relative of an addict or in the system, they say, they start to throw this recovery terminology. Oh, you can't have one without the other. They go hand in hand. And I think something I let my clients know at the forefront when they struggle with this, there's a bunch of people on the train that keep it going in the addiction. And not everybody gets off the train at the same time, right? It's not like everybody decides to enter counseling. It's not like everybody decides to get healthy and they go, all right, 3, 2, 1, and they all get off at the same stop. Some people get off at a stop and some people never get off. Some people stay on the train the whole time. Some people, you know, they get off at a stop years and years down the road. But there's clearly in this relationship, he got off the train, right? He's not engaging in the addictive behavior. He's doing what he can. And
You're talking about the dad.
Yeah. Yeah. Patty, he's doing what he can to eliminate for sure the direct acting out, process of drinking alcohol, but also he's attempting to make amends. He's going to meetings. He's doing a lot of things that on the outside look like, man, maybe there has been some change, but there's all this story and there's all this context that these people, this family system has engaged in for so long that, there are consequences. And that in and of itself is an opportunity for work to be done with clients to be like, okay, so you are sober, you are doing this work, you are getting healthy. What's it like to have an interaction like that, to go to people that you want relationship with and still not be given that, and being able to do work around that hurt and that loneliness and all of that, because
to be able to engage with the sadness.
Yes. The loss,
the loneliness, the loss.
Yeah. The recognition of, man, this is a consequence. I don't get sober and everything in my life goes back to the way it was. I get sober and I awaken to the chaos that I've really caused and cultivated and created. And I have to own that and do my work and hope in a God that's bigger than me, and hope that relationship can come back in some way. And the relationship may never come back. It may never come back in the way I want it to come back. I did air quotes. You guys can't see that in the podcast. But accepting life on life's terms and accepting the relationship for what it is. And you can see that tension that Patty's character, he clearly wants more. And I think Brennan does something that is very healthy. Some people might see it as, man, he's controlling, or he's being a jerk, or he's being resentful. Man, he's really honoring his boundaries, right? Dad shows up
out of nowhere,
uninvited, has means of communication, and doesn't respect that. He doesn't love Brennan enough to respect the way that Brennan has said, hey, here's what it looks like to do relationship with me right now. Brennan has given him clear opportunities and guidelines, and yet he violates that. And so Brennan does what is best for him, which is healthy. He loves himself. He really loves his dad well, because now his dad also knows, man, when he puts up a boundary and says, this is what's okay, I can trust that and know that that's what's okay. A lot of what we do with our clients is keeping our boundaries. Yeah. Like, hey, if you don't show up, you're still going to pay that money. And I know that may suck. And at the same time, you can now trust that when I say something, I'm going to do it. Yeah. And that's one of the keys to healthy attachment, is clear boundaries and knowing, like, man, I can trust you because you are going to do what you say you're going to do. Right. Addiction tends to not do that.
And I think what I really love about Brendan's enforcement of his boundaries is he's not cutting his dad off. No. You have two avenues of communication, phone and post office. So it's not I hate you, get out of my life, I never want to speak to you again. It's, hey, I'm recognizing that we've got some damage here, we've got some hurt here, in an effort to do the best that I can to keep myself, my family safe. We're going to limit the way that we communicate.
Exactly.
But we're not going to get rid of communication.
Yeah. Because it would not be safe for Brennan and his family to continue to engage addictive behavior.
Yeah.
Right? That's not fair to them. So to just say, oh, yeah, you can keep showing up and you can keep being drunk around us, like, that's not loving for Brennan. That's harmful to his family. And so, and it's really loving to his dad to say, I'm going to give you consequences to this unhealthy negative behavior in the hopes that it helps change. It may never change. You may just continue to go get drunk and I may never see you again. But ultimately, I'm going to hope that in protecting myself and my family from that behavior, that it also helps as a wake up call to see, look at what you're losing. Look what this is costing you.
Yeah. And I think you also see a difference in these two scenes that we've talked about so far. In Tommy's meeting with their dad, it appeared as if the dad was the one who was in control. In Brendan's meeting with the dad, it appeared as if Brendan was the one that was in control instead of the dad. And I mean, I'm sure that there's a million layers that we can unpack with that. Certainly being...
How are we only doing one podcast on this movie?
I know.
We can do a podcast per scene, it seems like.
Certainly one of them being that Tommy was drunk, like when he was talking with his dad, and Brendan was sober. Well, both of them were sober, but that's certainly one kind of aspect to it. But I think it certainly shows the way that each of the brothers are dealing with their hurt. And I think particularly with Tommy, you know, the reason why his mom and he fled the family was because the dad was an alcoholic and was beating, you know, the mom. And so for the mom's, and I'm sure Tommy's safety, you know, they fled. And Tommy, in the past 14 years since they left, you know, obviously, understandably, just a mountain of hurt, a mountain of anger, a mountain of loneliness, I'm sure, shame, guilt, sadness, and, you know, ended up choosing to deal with that in the same way that his dad dealt with it. And so, you know, here we have a great example of systemic addiction where we're not saying it's genetic addiction. We're not saying it's passed down biologically, but what we are saying is that, you know, Patty dealt with his hurt through alcohol. And now we're seeing Tommy is dealing with his hurt through alcohol. And I'm willing to bet that whenever Tommy comes back and sees his dad and hears and can see it demonstrated that his dad's gotten sober, on top of the resentment that he brought into the house, that there was some new resentment created right there, because here I am drinking, trying to get a handle on this hurt that is just ravaging my soul. And you're going to tell me that you stopped drinking? Like, you're going to tell me that you were able to quit this, that you were able to walk away, and I'm still stuck in it?
I'm stuck, yeah.
Yeah.
And he even, he says this one line, he says it twice in the movie, and one of which leads to this really big scene, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a second. But he says this line in that opening dialogue between he and his dad, so kind of going back in time before the scene that we were just talking about, where he says, "I think I liked you better as a drunk." And that's just this epitome idea of this term that we learn in our counseling education, this idea in systems where the system wants to remain in balance, wants to remain in something called homeostasis. So as soon as dad gets sober, and he's not engaging in the addictive cycle with everybody else that's in the system, they don't know, they're going to try as hard as possible to pull that person back into the role that they were in.
The system's going to try to correct itself.
Yeah, because the system knows how to operate if dad's a drunk and mom's codependent and son's being abused. Like it dysfunctionally functions, right? So when Tommy comes home and dad's no longer engaging in the system the same way, he's gonna throw stuff at his dad to try to get his dad back and to get his dad back drinking, because he at least knows how to interact with dad when dad is a drunk. He has no clue how to handle dad sober. He
Yeah.
has no, like he can't operate the way he knows how to operate Tommy until dad is a drunk. So until dad gets back to his role of being a drunk, I'm spinning my wheels. And so that's where he says this line, I think I liked you better as a drunk. And he says that and then immediately passes out. Right. That's the last thing he says before he drops this cap to his booze that he's drinking. And then he says it in this scene later on in the movie, that dad's already training Tommy. I think he's already fought in the big tournament too. Yeah, he's
had one fight.
He's at least had one fight in this big tournament, this Grand Prix style tournament. And Tommy's at this slot machine, and his dad comes out of the hotel. This is in Vegas, so dad comes down from the hotel into the casino. And
well, let's talk about how we get there first.
Yeah.
So the way that we get there is Tommy is now back, and we don't really know why he walked into a gym, but for some reason he walks into a gym that appears to be a boxing gym, some kind of combat sport gym, and says, how's this work? And the guy says $35 for a locker. We open at 11. No, we open at 7. We close at 11. And so he signs up. So he begins to go to the gym and spar. And then on the flip side of that, Brendan, we see, is a high school physics teacher, and at night goes to a bar for what his wife thinks is bouncing, but it turns out he is fighting in a parking lot with a ring. Mixed martial arts kind of fights to earn money on the side. And we find out that's because he goes to the bank, and we find out the bank's foreclosing on their home. So he's trying his best to earn the money to keep their home, And so there's a news conference. They announced, hey, there's going to be a mixed martial arts tournament. It's going to pay out this giant amount. While that's going on, Tommy at the gym, there's a guy in the ring. He's practicing fighting. He's sparring. They need a partner for him. So they say, go call that kid, whoever, to come up here and fight. And Tommy walks up to the side of the ring and says, hey, I can fight him. And they go, come on, man, you're just getting started.
You're just some
And then
guy.
he says, well, I can at least keep him warm till the other guy gets here. So they get in the ring, they ding the bell, and Tommy just lays into the guy, wastes him. And then we find out later that was like the number 1 ranked middleweight in the world. How convenient. And so the gym owner comes to Patty's house to try to find Tommy, because that's the address he listed, because he's like, man, this guy's good. I got to train him. I got to get him in the tournament. So to shorten things up a little bit, both Brendan and Tommy enter the tournament to try to earn money for their own respective reasons. Brendan to get the house back. Tommy, in a scene later, we see he calls a lady. He's on the phone with the lady and is finding out about how she's doing, how a kid is doing, and then says, I've got this opportunity. If everything works out, then I'm going to be able to send you a lot of money. And so at least with the information we're provided at that point, I was kind of thinking, oh, he has a daughter that he hasn't seen.
Yeah.
Similar to, he left a family, kind of like, him and his mom left, that kind of thing. And so they end up getting to, I don't know, Atlantic City. There's an ocean.
Oh,
right
it's
there,
Atlantic
so,
City. That's right.
okay.
Not Vegas. It's AC.
So Atlantic City, it's at this big hotel. There's this big tournament. And so they begin to kind of show, Brendan has a fight. Tommy has a fight. And in this tournament, it's very much presented. Tommy is this unstoppable force.
Yeah.
And maybe not like the favorite, I guess. In my head, I thought, what's the opposite of an underdog? He's the overdog. And Brendan is very much presented as the underdog. So Tommy runs through people. Brendan struggles. Yeah,
and is not expected to
He does win,
and,
but it's a struggle. And then there's a scene where both Tommy and Brendan are running on the beach, and they come in contact with one another for the first time in 14 years since they had initially, their family had split. And we get a little bit more context to the story of what's happened. We knew that the dad was beating the mom. We knew that Tommy left with the mom. But what we didn't know is where was Brendan and all that. And we find out Brendan stayed with the dad. I just realized I didn't say spoiler alert at the beginning of all of this.
Well,
so if you haven't seen the movie at this point, we're halfway in. So I don't know, pause the podcast and go watch it.
Go
I
watch
guess.
the movie first. Yeah.
But like,
kind of brought it on yourself though.
yeah, I guess I put the title of the movie in the thing. So, but like Brendan stayed with Patty. He stayed with the dad. Tommy left with the mom, and Tommy says, we left and you chose to stay all because of that girl. And we find out, the girl is Brendan's wife. And he says it wasn't just a girl.
It wasn't just some girl.
I was in love with her. I married her. We have 2 girls, your nieces that you've never met. And he shows him a picture of his nieces. And Tommy says, I don't know them.
Were you in the war?
Yeah. And
he asked, did you serve? And he's like, no, I went.
Oh, because I think Brendan said, I'm your brother. And he says, oh, I didn't know you were a Marine. I didn't know you were in the war.
Yeah.
He says, well, I didn't. And he said, yeah, you're not my brother.
Then you're no brother of mine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So just trying his best to push Brendan away. Like, it hurts too much to engage with you.
Well, and I think there's an interesting dynamic there. He uses that term, like, you're no brother of mine. Like, he seeks to disown his family. So, again, I can't make sense of my own story. So I'm going to just opt out of it. Mm-hmm. That's not my real family. I'm going to go find a new family. His family was actually in the military. Mm-hmm. So he serves. We don't know anything about that. But up to this point, we know, okay, he did something in the military. There's like a flashback to a scene where maybe he helped save some guys, but we don't really know anything about that. But he seeks to rewrite his own story by writing himself out of his real story and saying, you aren't my brother. Those aren't my nieces. I almost said nephews. Those are my nieces. My brothers were the guys I served with in the military.
And I think maybe the scene right after that is a scene where they're showing soldiers in the desert, and one of them sees a YouTube video of the fight that Tommy beat the guy he was sparring with in his original gym. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's the guy. They run, grab a videotape, they pull it out, and it's this like kind of night cam footage that gets paused, and it's Tommy's face. So we find out that Tommy saved these guys from a tank that was going underwater or something.
He rips the door off the tank to save these guys that are about to drown inside.
Such a Bane move. I mean, I didn't realize that this was in the same kind.
He does have traps for days.
There you go. I didn't know this was the same shared universe as The Dark Knight Rises.
Well, he doesn't have the mask. That's the confusing part.
And now we know how he got it.
Yeah.
But and then we find out later what happened was there was a friendly fire incident, and it's never clarified, but potentially like Tommy accidentally killed a fellow soldier.
Well, his soldier, the soldier that died was the dad and the husband of the woman that he talked to.
Yes.
That has the kids. And
so because of that happening, Tommy decided, I'm going to go AWOL. I'm going to abandon my soldier.
Which is, again, the pattern. I can't handle what's going on, so I'm going to run.
Yes.
It's what happened in his childhood. Now it's what's happening with the military.
Although in the childhood, I'm sure it wasn't him choosing to run. It was probably the mom. But it was certainly a message that got reinforced when there's hurt, when there's fear, when there's loneliness, when there's sadness, shame, guilt. We're out of here.
That fight, flight, freeze.
And so in his abandonment, in his abandoning of his fellow soldiers of his unit, he sees this tank in peril and he saves them. He was saving them on his way.
On his way to go AWOL. Yeah.
And I think so there's a few fights, and then the scene comes up that we were referencing earlier. He's down in the casino playing slots. His dad comes up and is like, hey, I saw this news report. That was an incredible thing you did, that you did for those soldiers. And, Tommy is just brushing him off, this kind of thing. And his dad says, and I'm going to refer to my notes here because I wrote it down because it's such a powerful line. Tommy is just arm's length,
still
Dad,
oozing that resentment.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
And his dad says, Tommy, I'm really trying here. And then Tommy says, where were you when it mattered? I needed this guy back when I was a kid. I don't need you now. It's too late now. Everything's already happened.
Yep. And
in that part, you know, we mentioned earlier Tom Hardy, you could just see the rage coming out of him. And I think that's a part where you still see the rage, but I think you see the hurt and the sadness and the loneliness too.
Yeah.
Like he's even acknowledging, I did need you and you weren't there.
Yeah.
And now it's too late because everything that I needed you for has already happened.
Well, and going back to attachment theory and those needs, I think so many of us are taught, whether overtly or covertly, that you grow out of certain needs, that you grow out of a need to be affirmed and appreciated, and like that's a childish thing. But once you grow up and you grow out of it. And attachment theory flies in the face of all that and says like, no, those needs that you have as a developing child, they may look different in the way that they flush out in relationship, but those needs are still very much so there. And that's Tommy's way of saying, I don't have those needs anymore. Because if I can tell myself and I can tell you enough that I don't have those needs, maybe I'll believe it.
Yeah.
And that clearly doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't happen because he's still having to numb and medicate and be resentful, which itself is a drug to justify my own behavior. Like it's your fault, right? Like you were talking before, I have no role in this drama that we're playing out. It's all your fault because you were the drunk, you know?
Yeah. And I think, and I remember a therapist saying this to me, that when it comes to childhood needs, there's so many times in adulthood that you can see somebody still trying to get them met. Like maybe they didn't feel like they were adored or cherished or wanted when they were a child. And so in adulthood, you know, their main goal is I'm going to perform. I'm going to do what I can so that people will adore me, treasure me, cherish me, want me. And the therapist said to me, you know, there's some childhood needs that cannot be met in adulthood. And then, you know, I think I said something like, well, how do you get them met? And they said, you don't. All you can do is grieve.
You mourn.
Mourn the sadness that they weren't met, and then recognize and identify the needs you have as an adult, and then work on getting those met. And so, you know, it's just such a good example of Tommy, and I think it's taking one step closer. It's one step, even just saying, I needed you and you weren't there. And so when he says all this stuff to his dad, he ends it with something along the lines of like, he ends up saying, you're like a beggar on the street with a cup. And then he has his cup of chips and he's like, you know what, here's some money, take this cup. And he throws it at his dad.
Yeah.
So
and right before he says that line, he repeats his line he says earlier in the movie.
I liked you better.
I was right. I liked you better as a drunk.
Yeah.
And then he says, yeah, you're a beggar. Here's your cup. And then he tells him to get the F out of here. And literally like throws the cup at him.
Yeah. So Patty gets up and he, with his whole body, is showing
like,
sadness.
Like Eeyore. Yeah.
He gets up and is like shuffling off.
Yep.
And then the very next scene, when the camera kind of comes in from black or whatnot, it's clear, you know, it's in mourning, not M-O-U-R, but like the A-M.
M-O-R, yeah. It's A-M, yeah.
And Moby Dick, the audio recording, is kind of a theme that goes throughout the whole movie. In and out, it'll start playing in the movie. And so we hear it, and then we hear Patty speaking over it. And
like a commentary almost.
Yes.
Like he's
and then we hear him begin to yell, begin to scream.
Well, and even his dialogue is very slurred. So you know, but we haven't seen him yet. It's still showing these like
It's
shots of the
pans
hotel,
of the bed.
So you can't like see what's going on yet, but you can hear his voice. You can tell something's off.
And he's saying, and this particular scene was really tough to watch. And even like we had some issues with our Apple TV this day. So like when Leanne got home, she didn't get to watch the whole movie, but I was able to show her the two scenes we've talked about already, and then this scene, and then a scene towards the end. She like, I mean, just watching this was just tearing up on the couch, and I don't know how you couldn't, but it's the dad. He's in his room. He's in an open bathrobe, and he's drunk. He has spent the whole night drinking because from what Tommy said to him, it was a hurt that he didn't have the tools to deal with.
Yep.
Like it was a hurt that was so big. And I know that like in addiction, in recovery, part of that is, the person who is recovering is going to be given tools with how to deal with their emotions, how to deal with, the feelings that they're having, the things inside of them. And the longer you're in recovery, the more those tools increase. But there's always a level of hurt. There's always a level of feeling that the tools aren't great enough to help you deal with. And so the ultimate tool of recovery is community. Mm-hmm. The ultimate tool is in those moments where, and it doesn't matter if you've been sober for, a day, a week, a year, a decade, whatever, in those moments where it's too big and you can't take it, you reach out to your community, you reach out to those that you love, that you trust. And in essence, it's, I don't have the tools to deal with this. Will you please help me? Mm-hmm. And it's, sharing of what's inside of you and accepting that support and that love. Mm-hmm. And once again, having that need met. Patty wasn't able to do that from the hurt that Tommy gave him in there. So he turned back to alcohol, losing his 1,000 days, which he cherished so much. Yeah, so obvious in there. Yeah. And as this scene in Moby Dick is being played, being spoken, he's yelling, turn the ship around, and
he's
slowly
raging. You literally see like his face is contorted,
slobber's flying
he's
everywhere.
He's like cussing. He's like, he's just completely, he's lost control. Yeah. He's lost it. He's powerless over the alcohol.
And Tommy wakes up and slowly kind of sticks his head around the door and sees his dad. Mm-hmm. His dad looks over, sees him, and walks super quickly to him and is yelling in Tommy's face, turn this ship around. It's going to kill us all. It's going to kill us all. And then you see the dad slowly begin to go from this like raging anger monster yelling to just sadness. And he just keeps saying, we're lost. Yeah. It's hopeless. Yep. And he begins to cry. Oh my gosh, I'm tearing up now.
Yeah, it's this is the scene I always show, like at Men of Valor or at the Refuge. Like this is the scene showing hurt. Yeah. This is the scene I always show the guys.
He begins to tear up, and it's we're going to be lost too. We're lost. And he rests his head on Tommy's shoulder.
Yep.
And the previous night, Tommy was pushing him away. And at this moment, Tommy actually puts his arms around his dad.
Yeah.
And then takes his dad over to the bed and sits him down, and Tommy gets behind him.
Yeah, he takes off the headphones he's listening to, takes the alcohol out of his hand.
And then his dad lays down and Tommy holds him. He like cradles him like a baby.
Yeah, literally. Like sits down back up against the head of the bed. Dad's head and shoulders are in his lap, and he's just like, and there's such a distinct change. So Tommy finally got what he wanted, right? He said all along, I think I liked you better as a drunk. And he gets what he wants, right? He's hurt him enough that he got him back in the system. Mm-hmm. And then the Tommy that you see is not the raging, he's not the fighter, he's not the drunk. He looks like a kid again. Like as he pokes his head out of the room and his dad comes up, he doesn't bow up like he's ready to fight back. He shrinks back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I know how to do this.
Yeah.
And then he begins this caretaking element, but and we don't know a ton past this scene what their relationship looks like, because this is towards the end of the movie. But my guess and my hope is that he sees externally, like he sees now in his dad, man, this is what I look like. Mm-hmm. Like this is what I look like when I'm drunk, when I'm an idiot, when like that's not okay. And so he begins to care for his dad in that moment. And it is for sure, without a doubt, one of the most difficult scenes to watch as far as relapses are concerned. But you see, once Tommy finally is able to engage his hurt and get it out, he's able to actually begin the process of healing. That's why we experience the emotion of hurt, is so that we can recognize where we've been wounded and where there's pain, so we can begin to heal. If we never experience hurt, we would never know, we would never have pain. We'd never know what needed to be worked on and healed. So it's a gift. It's a painful gift. It sucks. But it's there so that we can know what needs to be healed. And clearly with the amount of hurt that happened, there's a lot of repair that needed to happen between he and his dad. And this is the first scene where we're like, okay, maybe this is what was needed to get us there.
And I think a big component in it is that I feel like that's the very first time that Tommy accepted his dad for who he is.
Yes.
And not, carried hurt or anger for who he thought his dad should be. Mm-hmm. He just said, this is dad for who he is, and I'm okay with it. I'm sticking with it. Mm-hmm. And he just laid there and held him. Mm-hmm. It is just such a powerful scene. And I think for a movie that maybe wasn't the most successful, maybe didn't, win any awards, it just had such a wow factor to it. Going on from there, you see the two brothers advancing in the tournament. Brendan gets some wins, and people are, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy is gonna, and wins with stuff like a Kimura lock and like some pretty hardcore.
Yeah, it's like legit MMA. It's not kickboxing. Yeah, it's like, okay, I'm gonna take down, I'm gonna submit, I'm gonna stand and throw. Like, it's got all of it.
Yeah, very much a Ivan Drago, I will break you kind of. And so, of course, as a movie like this, you'd expect the two brothers end up as finalists in the tournament, and they're going to fight each other. Mm-hmm. So, they get in the ring together. The fight starts. 3 rounds. I believe it's, and everybody's expecting, Tommy's going to run through Brendan.
Yep.
He's just going to, totally, because there was one fight earlier where he knocked a guy out with the very first punch.
First hit.
It was like supposed to be the shortest, knockout.
Yeah, he ducked and threw a hook, and the guy went down immediately, and that was it.
That was it. So they're expecting that to happen with Brendan, but Brendan survives the first round, and the second round has, Tommy in, it's not a Kimura, but it's some kind of shoulder lock.
He just picks the guy up and...
Yeah, and he's yelling at Tommy the whole time, just tap, and Tommy's just refusing. Nope. And Brendan ends up breaking Tommy's shoulder, or separating it, or something. Separates his shoulder, to where, his arm is tucked. And, after that, when they get into the third round, Brendan, I think, gets him in another lock. Isn't that it? Like, how does
it gets him in a rear naked chokehold because Brendan's like, what are you doing? Like, stop fighting.
You're done.
It's so clear Tommy's shoulder is dislocated, so his arm's at his side, and he's still coming at Brendan, just throwing his other arm, trying to hit him. And so Brendan, is like, all right, like, I love you enough to hurt you. Which, again, intimacy, right? Yeah. Like, if I'm doing intimacy with you for real, like, it's going to be messy. There's going to be hurt involved. So he's like, okay, if you aren't going to listen to reason, then here's love. Yeah. And he takes him down, and he submits him. And while he's choking him out, he's
literally yelling in the middle of the ring, I love you, Tommy. I love you, Tommy. I love you. While he's got him in a rear naked choke.
Tommy, just tap. And again, like you said, I'm starting to tear up now, too, because it's like, it's this scene where, and this was a small piece of my story. There was a time when I didn't know how to express my emotion, and I was in this group therapy setting, and I actually, my therapist changed his seats, like, within the circle, turned my seat next to his, and just started antagonizing me because I was so shut down. I was unwilling to feel. And the only way that I knew was okay, air quotes again, based on what society says was okay as a way to express my emotion was physically, right? That's what men do. If I have emotions, I'm going to fight you. So I spearheaded my therapy, like, I tackled him. And that was, I think was his goal. I hope, maybe not. But it's this way that I don't know how to, like, in a healthy way, express my emotion. So the only avenue I have is through physicality. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is representative of this scene. I'm sure Tommy had no freedom to experience his emotion, but fighting was okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two meet in this last scene of, it's okay. I love you, Tommy. And he's able to, like, Tommy's able to get his hurt out physically, to a point where the two brothers, like, so Brennan wins. Again, spoiler alert, sorry, but you also listen to the podcast knowing the movie. So they get up, and rather than, like, accepting an award or anything, Brennan, again, tearing up, puts his arm around his brother, walks out of the ring, and is just hugging him and holding him. And that was reward enough for him.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't, like, yes, he did it for his family to get the money, all that. But, man, like, the only thing he cared about in the moment was, I got my brother back.
He has his brother back.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the movie. Like, there
it
is
literally
no,
cuts to black after they're walking out of the
he
ring.
goes on to be a UFC champion.
Yeah.
There is no, he defends the belt against whoever.
Yep.
Like, the end of the movie was and, you know, as they are walking out of the ring, you know, it goes to Patty, and
It
he's
shows the
expressing
dad.
his approval.
He's just beaming. He's so proud and glad to see his two sons together again.
And I think, and this is really the ultimate gift that this show is giving me. So, like, you texted me at some point about, you know, oh, did you finish the movie? Like, did you watch it, and how did you like it? And I wrote back something like, yeah, it was a really good story of forgiveness up until, like, the last hour, and then it was just punchy. and you kind of wrote back and broke down, you know, that symbolism of, you know, Tommy experienced his hurt enough to where he could finally surrender, and that surrender is what ultimately was able to bring him and Brendan and Patty back together.
Mm-hmm.
And then after, you know, reading that from you and going back and watching it again, you know, seeing that, I thought, oh my gosh, absolutely. And I told Leanne, because we had rented this on iTunes, and I told Leanne, I kept talking about the scene, and then I just went, crap, I'm gonna have to buy it.
Just buy it. Just buy the movie. I'll just tell everybody right now, just buy the movie. It's you're just gonna waste money renting it because you're gonna want to buy it anyway. So.
It's and I think that ultimately that's something that I am experiencing as I continue to do this show is, even if I don't like the movie, as soon as I talk to the person that chose the movie, because that's really how this is working, is the guest on the show is picking the movie.
Yep.
As soon as I talk to them and they explain, you know, why they chose it, we talk about it, we break it down, all of a sudden I'm finding out, oh my gosh, I love this. I love this movie, you know, and it's really just because this other person is telling me why it connected to their heart and why it connects to the people that they work with. So Warrior, I mean, just this brutal depiction of addiction, of how it can tear a family apart, and then through acknowledging your hurt and willing to speak it and willing to really stick with it enough, even though it's painful symbolism, how that can begin to build the bridge for not just recovery from addiction, but recovery of a family. So yeah, I liked it. It's pretty great. Jared, thank you so much for coming on. Let's say that there's somebody that is listening to this show and they're in or around the Nashville area in Tennessee, and they would love to come see you as a client.
Yeah.
How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So I don't have social media. I don't have a website. I'm not that official, I guess you could say. You could email me at my name, which is Jared, and then Farley, Farley, at sagehillcounseling.com. Or you could go through the Sage Hill website and contact another therapist that's there. All well-trained, all great people. If I'm full or unavailable, I know a lot of great guys and women that I can refer you to as well. So, but that's the main way to get a hold of me is through that email.
Yeah. Could somebody, let's say they get online and they try to book with you and, you know, you're full. Could they email you and maybe ask, who would you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Josh is one of the guys I recommend. So, but there's a number of clinicians I know and trust. I would trust to do my own work with. That I'd be more than happy to refer you to. Addiction is, you could almost say is a specialized demographic. I think there are clinicians that like to do it. It's an area they have a passion for, and there's a lot of great men and women who do work with addiction here in Nashville. So
there we go. Well, Jared, thanks so much for stopping by the theater.
Thanks for having me, man.
All right. So, my love, you had a chance to listen to the conversation between Jared and I. And, I mean, you've listened to many conversations between us before, usually in person. But in this case, you listened to a recording of it. What did you have any thoughts on what you heard?
You know I did. Yeah, I, first of all, loved the whole thing, especially when you guys cried a little bit. And I also cried in the movie at the part where Patty is, would you relapsing? Is that what you would call that?
Yeah. I mean,
like reading and yelling things about the book Moby Dick, and the whole thing was just, that was a very sad scene. That was very powerful. So A, that. And B, at one point when Jared, at the beginning, Jared kind of talked about his journey into counseling and, why he wanted to be a therapist and what brought him there. And he sort of went through a little abridged life story. And when he got towards the end of it, he talked about having a thought or a feeling that asked, why did I end up here? Like, he couldn't make sense of it because, he had good parents. He grew up in a, quote unquote, good home and grew up in church. And he kind of named these things that just made me think about ways that I've tried to make sense of stuff that's happened to me or stuff that's going on in my life. And I think it is pretty normal for people to question and try to make sense of, using those factors. Well, I was raised in this kind of house, so I shouldn't be experiencing this, or my parents were this, so it doesn't make sense that I would struggle in relationships the way that I do, or, this shouldn't happen to people who are as educated as me. And the reality is that's just not the case. I think so many of the challenges that we face just as humans can't be contained to a specific, race, class, gender. I think the reality is, if we could know everybody's story that we come into contact with, we would see that challenges like that life gives us, whether it's like addiction, abuse, depression, they're just not relegated to a specific group of people. And I think that's such a hard thing to grasp, especially when you're in the middle of experiencing something. And Yeah.
And before we started recording, you were talking about specifically like a population that you have a lot of passion working with, and that's women in, or rather coming out of abusive relationships. What was the statistic that you were sharing?
Yeah, somebody just had once told me that 1 in 4 women have either been in an abusive relationship of some sort. And I just remember hearing that and being so shocked. And my thoughts were everything that I just mentioned. I just thought, but is it not relegated to a certain, income status, a certain lifestyle of like a home, like maybe separated parents, or like just whatever it is, like, is there not, I just thought if somebody experiences something in childhood or experiences something because of a way they were born, that's why they would be in an abusive relationship. And I think widely in society that's like a belief that's held. And so finding that out, the person just said, that's not, if it's 1 in 4 women, it's not. It doesn't matter how educated you are. It doesn't matter how much willpower you have. It doesn't matter what home you came from. The reality is an issue like that just doesn't confine itself to one group of people. And yeah.
Other than in that particular example, women.
Well, yeah. But also, we know that that's not even true either. Like, men experience it, and men are absolutely in abusive relationships.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think in that example, in that statistic that you were given, 1 in 4 women, 25% of all women, and that's not 25% of African American women. It's not 25% of people on a lower socioeconomic scale women. It's not 25% of career women or 25% of homemakers. It's 25% of women.
Yeah.
And so I think that whenever anyone is dealing with something that they feel out of control of, whether it be they are a part of an abusive relationship, whether they are struggling with addiction, whether they are grieving the loss of a loved one, whatever it may be, sometimes it's just difficult to understand and accept and grieve something that's happened. And I think naturally within us as humans, whenever we have a tough time understanding something, we are afraid. Most fears are the result of a lack of feeling in control. And whenever we feel afraid of something, the natural human response is to try to take control. And so in these situations, if a person is feeling out of control, oftentimes it is an attempt. I was going to say it is comforting, but it's not. It's an attempt to comfort, to say, oh, well, this happened because of, I'm an addict because my parents got divorced way back when. And so I turned to the addiction to help myself. Or, I choose the men that I'm in a relationship with because, my dad didn't love me, or I, fill in the blank. And the truth of the matter is it's never one thing. It's never one event. So it's not like, we could get into a time machine, and if we could just change one event, then everything in life would be different. One event may have been a match that lit a fuse. It may have been a grain of sand that started rolling down a hill and started forming the snowball. But whenever we make choices have consequences. And in the same way that, people are a part of systems, choices branch out into systems of their own. And addiction, existing in a relationship, grief, all of these things, there's no easy answers. There's no, if you could just find the one thing, it'll all make sense and you'll be able to move past it. The truth is that, like with most mental health and relationship things, it takes a lot of work, and a lot of times that work takes a long time.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with what you're saying, that like trying to find a reason is a way of feeling in control, but I also think in a weird way it's taking the control for healing like outside of yourself. So if I say, oh, I experienced this because of this fact about me, then that means that I don't necessarily have to do the inner work that I need to do to heal from it, or to get better, or, fill in the blank. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying, but I think that's a factor too. And what you were just talking about, being easy, like, because you're trying to make it easier by finding one answer, when the reality is, first, there's a lot of answers, and second, no matter what all of the answers are, you've got to emotionally process and do the work through, getting healthy.
And if you reach for one of those answers and it's something that you did, or it's something that you are, it's really tempting to think, oh, well, if I just stop doing that thing, or if I just become something different, it'll all be better. I just realized as you were responding right then, let me make something really, really clear. If you're a part of an abusive relationship, if you are suffering with your partner, abusing you, that is not in any way your fault. That is not in any way some grand, conflicting, complicated thing. That is a choice that your partner is making, and a wrong choice. And so if you are a part of an abusive relationship, I want to invite you, please, 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 please reach out for help.
Yeah.
Go to somebody that you trust. Go to a local counseling center. Go to an emergency room. Please reach out for help. Your safety is absolutely paramount, and your worth and your value is just absolutely to the sky high. You're just, I say all the time, you had a bad case of being a person. In this case, you have the best case of being a person.
Yeah.
You are so worthy and so valuable and so important to this world, and you don't deserve what's happening.
Cool.
I don't know if I would say that's cool.
I didn't think that you were trying to say that, just for the record.
Okay, but I just wanted to make it clear.
Yeah. Okay. So the second thing that I thought about or just noticed or wanted to highlight was when you guys talked about the scene where Patty shows up at Brendan's house and he wants to see Brendan's family and see his grandchildren, and Brendan sets these really hard and fast boundaries, and that scene was tough for me to watch. It's one of the scenes that I did get to watch, and I really felt for the dad in that situation. I just felt like he was trying so hard, and maybe Brendan should just be a little more understanding or compassionate, but I was really glad and more understanding when I listened to you and Jared talk about it, and talk about how healthy it can be for somebody to set boundaries and then to stick to them. And not just healthy for Brendan, he wasn't just protecting himself and his family, but that can be good for the person on the other end of the boundaries too, to learn that this person means what they say and is going to stick with it. And I think it reminded me of something that you always say about just mental health and recovery and going into therapy and doing work, is that you can't do it for somebody else. You can't do it specifically hoping that you're going to get a result from another person. Or you can, but it's not going to work out. You've got to do it for your own reasons, and you've got to find your why. You've got to find your reason to do it, and it's got to be something that's self-driven, which I just agree with, and I think that's key.
Yeah. Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning that man can get through any what as long as he has a good why. And in the case of addiction and recovery, the why has to come from inside of you. It has to be intrinsic. And the reason for that is that the only thing that we as people have control over is from our skin inside. We only have control over ourselves. And so if you build your recovery from addiction on an outcome that is not determined by your particular actions, i.e., if you're a person who comes to treatment, comes to recovery and says, I'm doing this so I can save my marriage and my wife's going to stay. The truth of the matter is you can enter into treatment, you can enter into therapy for 6 months, for a year and a half, or 2 years. You can be sober the entire time, and you can do some great work. And at the end of it all, your spouse can still choose to leave, and that's their prerogative. And so if they choose that, then what happens if that has been the foundation you've built all this on, if the foundation leaves? Now, that's not to say everything is guaranteed to fall down. That's just to say that there's a better than average chance that it will. And so what I say to my clients, which, my primary specialty is addiction. So when I say to my clients is, what's your dream of recovery? When you think about overcoming this obstacle in your life, what do you dream that your life looks like? Because I want them to know, A, that there is hope. It's one of the primary things that I always try to instill in my clients is that there is hope. B is that you have agency in this. You have ability in this. You may not be in total control because addiction is a monster that is just trying to follow you everywhere. But you do have agency. And C, I think I used letters here, and C is that this is your recovery. This is your sobriety. This is not yours and your spouse's. This is not yours and your friends. This is not anybody else's. This is yours. You only have control over you. And so because of that, when it comes to setting boundaries, and I think Jared mentioned this, you know, anytime that one person changes within the context of a system, it changes the entire system. And so in that particular case, you know, Patty got sober, and that changed the way that Tommy could interact with him. Brendan had been sober this entire time, but because Patty had been an alcoholic, or is an alcoholic, but had been a drunk in the past, Brendan had to set some pretty hard and fast boundaries because he had a wife, he had 2 young daughters. And so because of that, he had to determine what kind of interactions that Patty had with the family. And he wasn't saying, you know, hey, I'm going to have an emotional cutoff, you're out of here. He was saying, you can still be in my life. It just has to look like this now.
Yeah.
And so when Patty crossed that line, Brendan had to say, no, you don't understand. It has to look like this now. This is how it will look. And so Patty changed up the way that he tried to cross those boundaries. That was him trying to cross the boundaries that Brendan had. He played the sympathy card. He played, you know, his voice got a little trembly. And Brendan stood firm. And so that's health. That's employing the boundaries that you're setting.
Yeah.
So overall, good episode. You liked it?
Great episode. I loved it.
Nice. Well, that's this week's episode. So thank you guys for joining us. We're gonna go ahead and bring the lights back up and say that the theater is closed.